The Energy Transition Podcast takes you directly to the cutting edge of the global energy sector's shift, with a specific focus on the critical role played by oil and gas, as well as the pathways developing around a lower carbon future. Your hosts, Leslie Beyer, Energy Workforce and Technology Council's CEO, and Dan Pickering, founder of Pickering Energy Partners, are joined by Josh Lowrey, president of Upright Digital. Each episode engages industry thought leaders in an exploration of market-moving trends and topics, including new technologies, ESG, capital markets, inclusion and diversity, workforce innovation, regulatory influences, and the voice of the people. Join us as the Energy Transition Podcast looks at the state of the traditional energy and oil field service sectors, emerging technologies, and the path ahead in a world of lower carbon energy development.
Welcome to the Energy Transition Podcast. My name is Josh Lowrey. We are coming to you live from the floor of the Offshore Technology Conference in Houston, Texas, OTC for the locals and the people that have been here before. I am joined, as usual, with the co-host extraordinaire, Mr. Dan Pickering. How are you, sir?
I'm great, Josh. Good to be here, as always.
As always. I've missed you. I enjoy doing these. Our first episode we ever did together was a live episode. Do you remember that one?
It was.
At NAPE.
It was on the floor of NAPE. And
so
we're
pros at this.
Yes.
No
we
intimidation.
cannot be distracted by the people mooning the camera or mooning us or whatever it is.
You'll notice here, you guys can't see it off camera, but we had to put up some basically velvet rope type thing to block people. There were people just cruising through here. The lights meant nothing to them. Cameras meant nothing to them. We're like, one guy was like, why don't you put up a sign? I said, like a camera and a light? What kind of sign are we looking for here, man? But it's been great. The show is, you haven't been in many years. So when's the last time you were at an actual OTC?
I was thinking about that. It's probably a decade. And
okay. So it's changed quite a bit then.
It had, the setup's the same. Mm-hmm. There are a number of different companies. What's interesting is, I walked in, there was a big pump jack outside. Like, wait a second, Offshore Technology Conference, these guys haven't figured it out. Maybe they have figured it out. I noticed it.
Right.
But, the offshore business was so massive for so long, and then shale came along and sort of eclipsed what was happening offshore. Still very important globally, less important domestically. Big conference. I heard a lot of languages as I was walking from outside to inside.
No doubt about that.
So it's clearly a representation of the global business.
And really there was a period there where everybody kind of joked it was the Onshore Technology Conference because there were so many onshore different companies, frac and, oilfield service equipment type people that it just became very much oriented around that. So it feels very technical, or digital, I should say, this time. The show's a lot bigger this year than it was last year, which I'm happy as a Houston guy and an oil and gas guy. I'm glad to see that the show is balanced and
catching some momentum. Yep.
Well, and on that note, and we'll bring our guest here in just a second, but on that note, we are actually in the Energy and Transition Pavilion within the OTC. Mm-hmm. So we're not just at the OTC on some random area. There's a special area here. I don't know how many square feet it is, but it's big. There's a lot of companies have little booths here, and it's packed. It's been absolutely packed. So I think we're going to enjoy. We'll touch on this as part of the podcast, but I'm encouraged. What I'm basically saying, Dan, is I think you and I are single-handedly changing the industry here with what we're doing and bringing people from the oil and gas world over to the energy transition and getting them to understand how it's important and relevant. They need to pay attention to it. They cannot ignore it. So, you looked surprised that I was going to not brag about ourselves at the beginning of this.
I won't say single-handedly, but I'll definitely say that energy transition has great momentum within the energy community, which is good because it was adversarial for a while, and now it feels like it's very collaborative or at least overlapping.
So, Todd Bush, did you hear that transition, how he smoothed out what I said? That was
beautiful.
Brilliant, wasn't it? That's why he's professional. That's why he's the best at what he does. So we have a great guest today. It's fun to be able to do. Thank you for doing this live. Todd Bush, founder of Decarbonfuse and Fuse Markets. Welcome to the show.
Great. Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. And perfect setting inside of the energy transition kind of lobby and corridor right here. It's
pretty cool.
Excellent to see all these companies and the technology and the people kind of bringing everything together. So that's it's wonderful to see.
So have you ever done a podcast before?
I have done podcasts before, but not live. So this is a first. So this is it's
live
exciting.
meaning in person.
In person,
Yes.
and,
With an audience.
With an audience.
That's right.
That's right.
Well, the good news is they can only hear you out of the speaker behind me. So if you don't freak out, these people, they look at you, they can't hear anything you're saying. So the ones behind us can hear you. So, well, again, thanks for being our guest today. And I'm glad to know that we're throwing you on in your first live studio audience.
Podcast.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that I think the audience should do while we're talking to you is it gives them a chance, if they're at their computers, to look up and see what you do. So it's a weird place to start before you even talk about who you are, but that way folks can be perusing your website. So tell us your website address, and then we'll dig into who you are and what Decarbonfuse does.
Perfect. So go check out decarbonfuse.com. I have a newsletter around CCUS, hydrogen, and a little bit of electrification, and really thinking of it from the industrial and energy standpoint. So obviously, depending on the numbers, a third of emissions come from industrial and energy sources. So that to me is the big opportunity with not only energy transition, but just decarbonization in general.
Great. Well, Todd, take us back. First, the Earth cooled, then along the way, you were born. But tell us a little bit about who you are, where you grew up.
Yeah, excellent.
What's life before Decarbonfuse?
Right. So I grew up in a small little town in Colorado called Ray in the northeast corner. So born there, lived there for a little while. My parents worked at a small oil and gas company out in a kind of Yuma field up in northeast Colorado. And then that brought me to Dallas. So grew up in Dallas, ended up going to Texas A&M, and in between at Texas A&M, switched schools and played a little basketball, and then came back to A&M and actually finish out my degree. And a couple of years later, then went on to Rice University and got an MBA from Rice. So definitely moved around a little bit, but finally landed in Houston. And I feel like, I married a native Houstonian, so I feel like a Houstonian now, and enjoying everything that the city offers.
That's great. And so you have oil and gas in your blood. You're an Aggie. Mm-hmm. You have to tell us. He's a basketball player, clearly. Yeah. But so, what was your little side jaunt to play basketball? Duke or something like that?
Oh yeah. No, so I tried to walk on at A&M. It was clear it wasn't going to happen, and went to Southwestern University for a year. Played, got to travel around kind of southeast U.S. playing kind of, Division II, Division III basketball. Got it out of my system.
Okay.
And enjoyed that for that quick year. Realized I didn't want to study. I didn't want to graduate with an economics degree. Wanted something a little more kind of business or statistics or data oriented. So went back to A&M and finished up there.
Okay.
Nice. Yep.
You don't hear that too often. I wanted to be a little bit more statistics oriented.
Mm-hmm.
So this is going to be a good podcast. Anybody that wants the statistics oriented, we're going to get some great data.
His website reflects this, by the way. It's it's very data driven for sure.
Yeah.
Yes.
So Decarbonfuse again, but get us to from school to Decarbonfuse between there and here.
Yeah. So I ended up kind of starting off, left A&M and really focused on financial software. Ended up working for a small, another kind of Rice grad who really focused on loan and lease software. It was my first kind of entry into kind of the business world. Knew that I wanted to get back to oil and gas. I was working in Houston and literally traveling kind of East Coast to West Coast. And so we decided, my wife and I at the time decided I had to figure out a way back into oil and gas and really be in Houston. So ended up working for a small consulting firm that helped me get recruited into Chevron and ran their digital, I'll call them digital oil field programs, but everything from health and safety to reservoir optimization to production optimization type of programs at Chevron, and enjoyed dealing with the different asset teams and different personalities and ways of working, I suppose. And
so internal applications at Chevron.
Yeah, internal applications. So, water alternating gas tools, water flood tools, really focused on some of the software, but also the lean kind of Sigma elements of that. So that's kind of the statistics piece of that I kind of bring into not only the conversation, but also bring into some of the projects that I work on now. And while I was there, got more into kind of the economics of these individual projects, what they looked like from an oil and gas perspective, what it looked like from EOR perspective, which I thought was fascinating, and ended up getting a little bit of an entrepreneurial bug and decided to leave and join a smaller company called Rig Data that was all around kind of drilling information and help launch a few products. And I went there to help the owners find an exit. They didn't want to exit. So I ended up going out on my own, starting Energint with a friend that I'd known for a long time, and he was another Rice grad and UT grad. And so we ended up building out Energint with a lot of information, a lot of data for kind of the underserved, or what we thought kind of underserved oil field service supply chain. So worked a lot with drilling contractors, frac companies, frac sand companies, that whole logistics piece. And we sold the business in 2017. And then I stayed with the company.
To one of these data aggregator types?
Yes, Westwood Global Energy, which they were a private equity-backed kind of platform that wanted to bring together both offshore, onshore, and have kind of a global perspective on it. So ended up doing that and stayed there for about 4 years. And during that time, obviously, there was a lot of discussion around emissions, this movement from how do we tell our ESG story as a service company or a supplier. And so got involved in a number of those projects that were looking at how do we tell this not only ESG story, but also deliver value through kind of a low carbon or kind of reduced emission perspective. So got involved in those projects and knew kind of as I was leaving that I wanted to stay in that area, and had some contacts back from my Chevron days that I talked to around CO2 and EOR, and really wanted to explore the CCUS space. And so a lot of my time now is really digging in on carbon capture and in my opinion, kind of how it underpins a lot of the energy transition.
So 17 you sold, you stayed there
till 21.
Okay, so
yeah.
This is what we're talking. This new venture's about a year something old.
Yeah, just brand new.
Okay,
yep.
Great. So that brings us to Decarbonfuse. And so tell us about the business. What's it do?
Yeah, so right now the newsletter is decarbonfuse.com. So you can go on, look at kind of company sustainability data. There's a carbon capture kind of project information portion to that, and obviously a daily and weekly newsletter. And so that I have a small team working on, really just trying to grow the newsletter. It's a couple thousand people right now. And on the side and along the way, had a vision for developing some other tools and potentially doing consulting around the energy transition. So those are actually kind of through Fuse Markets, which is the entity, not necessarily the site. And so through that, I have been doing and kind of building a team for carbon capture, primarily carbon capture consulting. So looking at it from source to sink, how do you characterize the emissions? What does the storage look like from a geologic perspective? How do you get that CO2, to storage, transportation, and the facilities and the wells that are all involved? And then bringing that all together with kind of the economics and evaluating it for whether that's a cement company or an ethanol facility or even a midstream operator, right?
So you're going to work on the consulting side of the business. You would work for someone who owns pore space or someone who's an emitter, or both?
Both, potentially.
Okay, got it. And the newsletter, what is the purpose there, to just educate, or is it an advertising model that's going to kind of a standalone business, or what's the thought process there?
Yeah, it started off mostly education, because there was a lot of people, especially in my network, that weren't too aware of some of the carbon capture and hydrogen technology and the projects. And so that, I think, element is going to be free for quite a while, and then there'll be kind of a monetization angle there down the road, but not too focused on that. I think the consulting and kind of the other projects will help kind of fund that and keep it going.
Are you working with anybody now?
Yes, so we have, so just on the team that we're kind of working together on the consulting side, a former chief engineer from QEP, his name is PK Pandy, and then other folks on the geology side where we can actually conduct the entire project. So if it's the reservoir engineering piece or potentially really digging into kind of the pore space and valuing the subsurface side, we can get into that. And trying to do the economics around all of those projects. So one of the things that comes up a lot right now is costs, and what does that look like for not only just capturing the carbon, but also transporting, storing, and sequestering it.
You know, we've had you said you'd listened to a couple of our previous podcasts. That's been a big subject for us in the last 12 months.
Yeah.
I mean, is any of the projects that we've had or that you've seen in the last 12 months that you're like, hey, that's exactly what we should be doing, or that's a position for us?
Yes, so I think for some of the companies right now, the ethanol facilities definitely feel like the first mover with carbon capture, and there's a number of projects. So for example, kind of looking at or tracking over 160 projects in North America. I think that number is
160 carbon capture projects.
Carbon capture projects. I think that number is really low because there's several projects in there that really can't talk about yet and that aren't announced and that are at the early stages of kind of feasibility. So I think that number is going to go up dramatically by the end of the year. And then especially with a number of the CCUS projects where they're looking at feasibility, they're looking at the bottlenecks. You hear a lot of the common kind of bottlenecks around the regulatory environment and really understanding kind of the costs and the detail around it.
Yeah. Todd, we keep hearing emitters are one of the big, there's plenty of pore space in the U.S. Plenty of folks controlling that pore space saying, hey, bring your CO2 here, and that the emitters have been the slow ones to move. You mentioned ethanol. That's because ethanol produces CO2. You don't have to capture anything, so it's a low cost, if you will, source of CO2. Talk to us a little bit about just how you see this timing gap between the emitters and the sequesterers, if you will.
So the timing gap, especially thinking about the regulatory side, we're seeing, I'll use round kind of months, but anywhere between 12 and 24 months to get a Class 6 well permit kind of through the process. Now that could change dramatically as Louisiana gets a little closer for their primacy and controlling that process a little more along with the EPA. I think with the ethanol facilities specifically in the Midwest, you have the regulatory environment and a number of projects that don't want to be first. So you have some aggregators that are looking at the pipeline side and even a number of facilities that have are near CO2 EOR type of fields. So there's opportunity, there's existing infrastructure or a little bit of existing infrastructure for some of those ethanol affiliates to move from thinking about a project to doing it within the next, call it 2 to 3 years.
What's the hesitancy to not want to be first?
I think that capturing the carbon today with known technology gives everyone, and really puts everyone at ease, but the ownership and the structures of a lot of these companies on the ethanol side, and you could actually start dissecting each emitter and each company this way as well. The large companies that like Poet on the ethanol side, they're already bringing together all their facilities to run a large project.
Aggregating their own.
They're aggregating their own. So other smaller facilities, I think, are going to watch to see how it's done, maybe even go with some of the same suppliers, same vendors, and there's certainly a number of former kind of oil and gas and energy folks that are talking to them, helping them through the process.
We just had, I had to step in for Jim Wickland, our friend from on another podcast this morning, and they had NOV on their podcast and talking about oil and gas and a couple of different things. And honestly, they wanted to talk about energy transition and the role that they played. And you mentioned oil and gas is just, they see, and to Dan's point earlier on this podcast, NOV is playing a big role from an equipment standpoint. We've had some of our other guests on there from the equipment standpoint. Mm-hmm. I would imagine you're seeing, what's the word? An eagerness from this crowd to step in and be a part of what you're, at the equipment side, certainly the equipment side, like they're trying to figure out how can they transition whatever type of equipment they have now into where do these things go for the next run and the next projects, right? Yeah. So is it really just, because it's got to be some of it technology and equipment at the same time. Is it also policy that slows us down, or is it money? I mean, or all the above? Yeah,
policy and money for sure. Yeah. So we did a study for kind of Gulf Coast storage assessment and mapped out like what the potential projects could be, what the scenarios that different field development plans could look like, and what that would mean for everything from pipelines to wells to CO2 compression. And it's fascinating to see kind of the knock-on effect of a couple projects, and that eagerness is definitely there. Mm-hmm. So we're anticipating as these projects get built out, there's going to be a supply chain bottleneck. There's going to be I'll say a run or a push for certain types of equipment along the supply chain. But in the end, I think they'll work through that and make sure trying to keep the cost down and trying to get the project delivered, I think will be the most important thing. So hopefully that answers your question. I think the policy is one that is always going to come up, and I know there's a little concern about the IRA and 45Q and how do you qualify, and making sure not only the emissions but the CO2 sequestration side is kind of all the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted for that. But that feels like that's becoming more understood, and then as more states gain primacy, that will help kind of. It's not going to be a flood of Class 6 wells, but at least in Louisiana, hopefully Texas in the future, potentially other states will begin getting that primacy as well.
When you think about how the dollars get split up, the IRA was clearly a big deal in terms of putting more money into the system. So do you think emitters want to capture a piece of that? And how big a piece do you think they can capture when we think about an $85 45Q tax credit? How are we going to stretch that money across the various emitter, transportation, storage, sequestration, et cetera?
Yeah, great question. So there's just going back to the ethanol side for a bit, there's definitely some different business models emerging. So you have some that are trying to do it themselves and just partnering with the subsurface team that can help with the facility development and own that entire value chain and get all the tax credits.
So they want equity the whole way.
Equity the whole way to kind of this CCS as a service model, which would be more of we'll take the CO2 from you and we're going to probably take the majority of those credits and we're going to handle everything else, to several companies doing some variation of a JV where there's going to be joint ownership. And those definitely seem to be the common ones that are at least coming out in the early projects.
So you're saying the CO2 emitter is, rather than just handing it off and saying, okay, either give me a slice of these credits or I'll pay you something, they're saying, oh, wait a minute, there's money here, and so I'm going to own a piece of all of it. I want to own part of the pipeline, or I want to own part of the end storage facility.
In some cases, yes.
Interesting. Do they have to have a lot of volumes to do that?
They do, and it's not, I think that will be only a handful of companies that do that versus kind of the CCS as a service approach.
Yeah. And Todd, one of the things that, so I forget the names, but we got a big CO2 pipeline being built from the Midwest, I think, to North Dakota. Mm-hmm. And then there's one going south. Mm-hmm. And I don't remember the names of either of them, which bad on me. But Isn't there anything? Is there no geology nearby that can do this? You know, in the Midwest?
There's definitely some. You think of Kansas, a little bit in Nebraska. There's potential there. I think the amount of storage is what I believe it's Summit Carbon that's going north to North Dakota. I think moving the project along, they already had access to a sequestration well. That was probably appealing. The other amounts of storage, whether they're saline aquifers or even kind of depleted oil fields, they're not the same volume that you can get in other areas, especially Gulf Coast, if you're comparing there.
So you just can't put enough volume away. And so you can spend, I think, Summit's $4 billion or $3 billion. It's a big...
Yeah, I feel like it just keeps growing.
Yes, it's billions. So they're obviously making a play that this is going to be a big and long-term market.
And I think the other one to keep in mind that's interesting is Tallgrass Midstream, where they're taking a natural gas pipeline, converting it, and then I don't know exactly where they're sequestering, but likely in Wyoming or Nebraska, and then connecting some of those facilities to their existing kind of pipeline network.
Okay. And when do you think we see our first meaningful CO2 sequestered in the United States?
Probably, there's some being sequestered now. It's not high volume, but I would say in the next 18 to 24 months, as some of these companies hit first injection and can actually show, okay, we can go and do some high volume with this one, we'll call it one sequestration site.
Okay, so late 24, early 25.
Yeah, that's probably optimistic on my part, but I think there's a good path to get there.
What would pessimistic be then? I mean, it never ends, or goes 3 years, 4 years? I mean, what do you...
Yeah, one of the statistics that no one likes talking too much about is if you look back at the carbon capture projects that were announced prior to 2020, 60% of them were canceled or put on hold or pushed out. So if you look at more of a pessimistic view, I would say probably closer to 2030, any meaningful thing, any meaningful CO2 getting sequestered there.
But looking at your website and talking about just the different policies that are in place now, there's a lot more incentive than there was in 2020. And then two, I was looking at, again, your website. Is that an aggregate that you have there, or did you build that yourself? If you built that yourself?
Yeah, we built it all and basically designed it and pulled everything together.
Can you explain to the audience what I'm talking about, just in case they didn't look it up real quick?
Yeah, so on the website, you can basically look up any public company within industrial and kind of energy, and cover a little bit of mining as well. And that'll give you a view of all the EPA facilities and a little rating around water, chemicals, and emissions, as well as their sustainability targets. And so really the thought there is, what are these companies saying they're going to do?
Right.
And then being able to connect them to the projects that are actually being funded. Yeah,
because I guess you're looking through their reports, obviously, and what their, I'm like 5-year statements, 10 years, here's where we want to be carbon neutral, carbon positive, et cetera, right? And you're pulling that out and then tracking how they're doing along the way?
We're not tracking how we're trying to track the projects.
Okay.
So as they announce projects and are actually completing, whether that's a sustainable aviation fuel investment, or maybe they're going to do something around hydrogen or something around carbon capture, then begin connecting the dots that way.
So the reason I'm bringing that up in tandem with the first part is it just feels like that's a spreadsheet, whatever you want to call it, that didn't exist 3-4 years ago, that people are now paying attention to on a lot of different levels. So I just wonder, like, the 2-year, optimistic view versus maybe what year in 23, 6-7 year pessimistic view. I just wonder if people can, if it just doesn't feel the same way this time as it might a couple of years ago. And that's what I just feel like there's a lot more attention on these things now than
Yes.
obviously there ever has been.
Yes,
I
absolutely.
mean, to the point where we're sitting right now.
Yeah, and so I've had a couple conversations with different folks in the DOE and I'm still waiting for a loan to come out on the DOE side for one of these projects, and hear about that. I know they're definitely funding kind of pilots and funding other things, but there's an enormous amount of funds available for either project funding, even equipment manufacturing related to carbon capture. So I'd like to hear more on that side to kind of build out the supply chain, but that hasn't quite happened yet. But I'm still optimistic that it's going to pretty soon.
Okay.
So what you guys are doing is helping one side or the other figure out how to move a project ahead. We've talked a lot about regulatory. Is that the biggest stumbling block? And then, so let's set that aside for a minute. What do you find is the kind of the area of focus that companies need the most help with? Is it identifying a good counterparty? Is it quantifying their own, CO2 emissions? Where do they need the most help?
Yeah, I'll start maybe from the source side and the emissions. I think the big concern there is cost. So moving and helping companies move from kind of a level 5 cost estimate, if you will, down the chain to get more certainty around what they're going to do. I think that's a key piece of it that a lot of the engineering firms are beginning to get their front-end design kind of work done. So we're seeing more and more of that. And then as you kind of move through the value chain, the other piece is the sequestration in the regulatory process. I think you can't really talk about carbon capture without going into detail on that front, because there's a lot of back and forth that has to take place, even with people that are very familiar with working with class 1, 2 injection wells. Class 6, it takes you want to look at the pore space, you have to do the plume modeling a certain way, and then that's the kind of standard on the...
Plume modeling a certain way. Explain what that means.
Yeah, so on kind of from a subsurface perspective, and you're going to be tracking your first injection for that particular well, and the plume modeling is essentially going to show and demonstrate to the EPA or the regulatory authority how that CO2 spreads across time. So what does it look like in 5 years, 10 years, 50 years, 100 years, 200 years? And at each different regulatory kind of, I'll say stage gate, if you will, you have to do that with the EPA. And let's say an ethanol facility wants to take advantage of LCFS and is doing something with the fuel side. So then you'd have to go to California and show CARB and show your plume model in a certain way so that you get that authority comfortable with everything that you're doing. So there's multiple steps in kind of appeasing different stakeholders in the value chain.
How can they show what's going to happen to your? I mean, I guess it's just. I mean, you're a stats guy, right? I mean, how are they showing this and modeling this out over that period of time?
Yeah, on the subsurface side, especially thinking about reservoir modeling and fracture modeling from the oil and gas side, it is very similar. So you're going to see the companies that are exceptionally qualified from the oil and gas side on reservoir modeling, really working kind of on the sequestration side for plume modeling as well.
Right.
But yeah, it's hard to imagine kind of that, that 200-year outlook.
Like, I can, in my head, I'm envisioning this, but I'm like, okay, I can get a 5 or 10 year deal, and then 20, and all of a sudden you're thinking, wait, 100 to 200 years out, things move, things change. There's just a lot of math involved in this that I'm sure that I don't understand, but yeah, that's what I'm curious is to think about what that actually looks like.
Yeah, and then that brings up a lot of risks too in the conversation. So if it is a depleted kind of oil field, then what does that look like? Is there potential seepage back through the subsurface through some of those wells? Is it an aquifer and maybe it's more secure and that it's capped, if you will? So definitely different models for different types of fields.
Are any of those concerns part of the delay? That is that a big portion of it? Like, hey, keep showing me until I believe it?
There's a little bit of that, but there's also the just the back and forth and the amount of kind of risk I'll say risk identification plus preparation plans, as well as for every Class 6 well, you're going to have to, like, what are you going to do if you have to shut in or reclaim the property or reclaim the land. There's all those contingencies that are laid out in throughout the kind of regulatory process.
And the emitter cares about this because if they give it to somebody, they put it in the ground and it comes back out, do they lose the credits or do they just lose credibility? I kind of like credits or credibility. I'm going to use that one. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So
I'll write that one down.
Yeah. The liability side is now you start looking at it from a state to state perspective.
Okay.
So some states are saying liability, they'll take on liability after a certain period of time. Whereas
the state will.
The state will.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, others are saying the company or the current owner has liability. So that's another piece on kind of the state regulation side and state law side that's going to come to play, without a doubt.
Yeah. Sounds a lot like what is it? They call them annuities, or for the plugged in abandoned wells, where they have to secure these for the long term as well. I mean, to make sure they're
abandonment liabilities.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, we've got a lot of history in the oil and gas business. We don't have a lot of history in the carbon sequestration business, although it's pretty similar.
Doesn't sound like the leap is too far. Right?
No, exactly. I'm going to jump around a little bit. So you've got Fuse Markets is, when I hear that, I think about things like trading credits or something like that. Am I stretching too far, or is that just what you're calling the consulting business?
That's essentially what, right now I have an entity, and that is consulting through that.
Okay.
So there's a possibility down the road that may separate the consulting business completely from Decarbonfuse. Mm-hmm. But right now, I think it's working pretty well because we get to attract people in and then really have more discussions around what specific angle within carbon capture they want help with.
Mm-hmm. And are you now we can zoom out a little bit. Are you a big net zero guy? You think we can get there, or is this an exercise in futility? How do you think about sort of the big picture goals that the world has around carbon?
Yeah, so I think the specific goals, without really digging into the economics on all the projects and all the countries involved, I feel like the stated goals that are out there are good to shoot for, but are not practical yet. And there's just a world that demands energy, and energy is increasing. And so I look at it as like this energy transition is bringing to bear new forms of, or maybe getting more creative around new forms of energy. So hopefully that answers.
Well, you called it a yes and. Is that
yeah. Yeah, that's basically, a lot of, it's interesting kind of sitting at this intersection between climate technology and energy and oil and gas and some of these other, I'll say, sources. You get a lot of conversations around, we can't fund fossil fuels. We can't do this. We can't go after, some new technologies that's out there. And my perspective is innovation is going to make this a reality. If it's 2050 or 2060 or whenever it is, we need innovation all across energy, across so many industries that it's going to take time and capital to get there.
Do you consider yourself an energy guy, or what do you consider yourself?
Yeah, I've kind of come from it from an oil and gas perspective. And energy, I think mostly now getting into the emission side a little more, working with different industries. I realized that there's this angle that if you talk within anybody at OTC, they're going to have a level of IQ about energy that just doesn't exist outside of the energy industry. And so whenever I get a chance to talk to anyone, I try to encourage them either with information or stories or data to take note of how critical energy is to everyday life. So,
yeah. Todd, we zoned in hard on carbon capture because we've done a lot on the podcast about that. You also mentioned hydrogen early on. And then a second ago, you mentioned economics and the energy transition. When I think about hydrogen, I think about economics that aren't there yet. Do you agree or disagree? Tell us how you think about hydrogen.
Yep, completely agree. And I think it is all about the demand. So where is market demand coming from for hydrogen? There's certainly an opportunity. I think if I was just, my own opinion is the kind of class, I'll say class 3 trucks seem like a good opportunity for hydrogen. You have to develop some infrastructure, but for all the uses of hydrogen, the danger of trying to do everything seems very real, and the economics aren't there for all the different use cases. So I think it's still a ways out, but it would be nice to see, outside of just ports using it in California and a little bit of industrial gas, it would be good to see some demand come through.
Yeah. It would be good to see that demand. What's going to be the catalyst? Is there some technology breakthrough we need to see? Is it regulation? Is it, we've done $3 a kilogram at the IRA. Should it be more than that?
I haven't dug into some of the regulation side on hydrogen as much as I have on carbon capture, but from what I can tell from a couple companies that I talked to, is that they feel like the regulation is there. They feel like they can make the economics work with the current regulatory environment, but they're really trying to find the offtake agreements to either seal their project or really get funding. So that's really the reason why I go back to kind of the band, whether that's a individual kind of offtake agreement or a new segment really pulling kind of hydrogen forward.
Yeah. Josh, it feels like we hear offtake agreements. We hear that a lot in our podcast. And I guess I'm coming more and more to the conclusion government's pushing this hard, right? And industry is trying to react and come to the decarbonization
economically.
Yeah, and it feels like the line in the sand is I'll spend a little money on spec, but if I'm going to spend a lot of money, I've got to have that contract. And the reality of this is that it's going to force innovation to get costs down, because we're just not going to see widespread adoption on the hope, right? There's a lot, there's a lot of I wish that politicians talk about, and business is going to spend a little money on I wish, but they're not going to spend, the trillions that we hear about. They're going to wait for some sort of contract. That contract may be government backed or not, but
I think it's going to have to be. There's too much short cycle decisions being made, right? With big money, that's a lot of money to invest in. What'd you call it? Hope earlier, or a wish?
Yeah. I mean, it's too much. We had a guest on here a few weeks ago, Michael Carney. They raised money
Dr. Mike.
They raised money with a 15-year time frame.
Right.
And when you do that, you can make some really long cycle decisions. The problem is they're talking about raising millions and investing millions, and this process involves trillions. So you got to get orders of magnitude changes, thinking longer cycle, and you just haven't had it yet. So,
well, and again, I think it goes back to what Todd was saying. I mean, if you get one, it works. There's going to be a lot. I mean, the first one of anything is really difficult, right? You get one of something that works properly and does it, you're going to have a lot of people going, all right, let's learn whatever lessons that was. Let's figure out how to make it more economically and quickly, and et cetera. And I think that's what turns this thing. I mean, it's all turning. It just really is. to the point of, we were joking earlier about the, kind of bragging on ourselves, or me while I was doing it. But like, all of this is shifting. I mean, these conversations, I really do feel like the tipping point does start to come to where, right now you have the politicians, and Todd, I guess we'll let you back on in a minute here, but it's like you have these politicians talking about things that they hope and want and wish, but the average guy and girl is starting to get it, and they're starting to see, like, okay, this is good for long term. This can make some substantial difference. We are making 200-year decisions. What does it really take? And I mean, trillions of dollars is a lot of money. But go back to our very first guest, one of the first guests, was it Jim Hughes, that he talked about just how much money was required, and then how short we're falling every single year.
Mm-hmm. It's a lot.
It's a lot.
Okay, we will let you back in. You mentioned you think a little bit about electrification. Mm-hmm. So talk to us about that.
Yeah, so I got involved in some of the early electric frac fleets, and got to see some of those up close and personal.
I'd like to hear that.
Yeah, so did some projects for companies that were evaluating how to power e-fracs, and then also other companies that were trying to do completely different approaches on either the blender or how much water was being used for the frac job. And so both of those were kind of electric angles for kind of equipment in the field. And
companies like Evolution.
Yep.
Well, sir. Okay.
Yes. Companies like that. There's a handful.
Okay. Just trying to put it together here.
Yeah. Even companies like maybe Liberty that were a little slower, and other companies that were doing things like dual fuel equipment to reduce the carbon intensity. And so,
because that world seems to have taken off recently. They're all kind of doing their own thing now at some level or another.
Yes, I wish I knew, a little more like where everyone was right now, but it felt like for so long they were like, oh, there's a fleet in Eagleford and Marcellus.
US Well, and Evolution, what are they going to do? Yeah.
And so it's good.
They're all to hear. They're all messing around in it now.
Yeah, that's great. So just on the electrification front, it seems like numerous opportunities, whether you're talking about compression. So you could have an electric CO2 compressor at a carbon capture site. You can look at it from a midstream operator perspective and figuring out how to reduce their carbon intensity along their pipeline. So really thinking of more from an operational side, not necessarily EVs or anything like that.
Do you have competitors?
Sure. There's on the newsletter side, there's a lot of different people poking and looking at energy transition from different angles. There's certainly the traditional energy research firms. I've come across a lot of individual kind of newsletters that are starting to get subscribers and monetize that view, whether that's individuals that are looking at just one piece of the value chain or trying to dig in. So there's, I think, quite a few competitors, but where I'm really trying to differentiate is if we keep that as kind of the marketing arm, if you will, then what can we do on the back end for new products, for consulting, and really deliver some of these large projects that are being talked about, trying to influence that and be a part of some of the larger ones that are going to get across the finish line soon.
Todd, what do you think are the 5, 3, 5, 7, whatever it is? What should our listeners be watching to see progress, whether it's CCUS or anything on the energy transition? What do you think are the top 5 things to watch?
Question.
Yeah, so fascinating. I think there's so many. I could come up with like 35, I think. But I'll maybe just say a couple that I think are top of mind. I'm watching very closely the public companies on the energy side, because right now, and specifically oil and gas, they are going to continue to be, they're going to face challenges in kind of community engagement, but they're also increasing their investment. So as we can see those companies go from they're just talking to doing and walking the walk, I think that will lay a good just a good platform for other people to follow. So, one interesting piece, whether you like it or not, the direct air capture launch by Oxy is one good step. Like, yes, this is a big marketing push, but also they're breaking ground in their building.
This was the thing that was on 60 Minutes last week. You were probably busy dominating the Vegas Oilman's tournament, but she was on 60 Minutes last Sunday talking about this.
Occidental CEO Vicki Holler.
Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Speaking like she's sitting here with us right now.
Yep. So I'm keep in touch with a few folks on the direct air capture side that are looking at new technology, new ways of capture, all that, and it's interesting when you can start factoring in. Oh, they're talking about Class 6 wells, and what does this mean for the difference between Class 1 and Class 6, and so that's good to see. And so those public companies that have the capital and can show the discipline to actually go through with a lot of these plans, I think is great. So obviously a little biased, but Chevron doing the same thing. I think there'll be other companies that come along from the public company side to help change the community, change the kind of stakeholder perspective of that.
Well, I mean, and not to put you on the spot, but do you think that Vicki did a good job explaining that to a national audience on Sunday?
I didn't watch the full thing.
Okay.
I only saw a little clip, but I would imagine, yes, just thinking and seeing her speak to other audiences.
Okay.
I would imagine.
I mean, she's a pro. She's excellent.
Did you think she did a good job?
Well, yes, I did, but at the same time, like there was feedback that it wasn't quite explained, that wasn't the shining light on that I thought that people were talking about, that it looked on the oil and gas industry. That's why I was asking from your perspective, like what was your take on it? But maybe I'll put a link. So
there you go.
Can,
let our listeners decide.
Yeah, and then
I'll
go to the other.
Again, not putting too much of a pressure on that question because, like I said, I know that's. Yeah, keep going.
So if I was to go to the other kind of end of the spectrum, I grew up, born kind of northeast Colorado. There's a couple carbon capture facilities, ethanol facilities, where Carbon America is actually running the carbon capture and sequestration. So I think if you have these two ends of the spectrum, the public companies that are moving forward with some of these large multi-billion-dollar projects, as well as other companies that are hitting singles and doubles, if you will, on the smaller facilities, then we can actually see progress. And right now, with 160 plus projects and only a handful that are moving, what seems like moving quickly, I think it'll do a lot for community perception, kind of stakeholder engagement at the local level, and a broader understanding of, oh yes, this is a good thing. We're reducing emissions, and we can show kind of those results.
Mm-hmm. Todd, what else should we hit before we do the lightning round? What other things, when you think about...
this was the lightning round.
Yeah, it's all a lightning round. This is the super lightning round coming up. But anything else that you think is important for our listeners to know about what's happening in energy transition, carbon capture, et cetera, the stuff that you're living day to day?
I think from the carbon capture side, especially if you have questions around the costs or how to begin looking and thinking about a project, definitely reach out to me. I think there's so much out there right now where part of that is just education. So we're doing kind of workshops around just educating teams. And then the flip side of that is actually digging into, how do I characterize those emissions? What does the geology look like? What does the transportation look like? And so that angle I'm excited about because it's fun to talk to, midstream operators and ethanol producers and cement producers. So you get a broad range of folks that are looking into this.
Mm-hmm.
I see a couple people that have been around. Do you have some of your team out here today with you as well?
I don't actually. No.
Okay, so we just have interested parties sitting there listening. Okay,
hanging out.
And before we do, what position did you play?
Oh, I was kind of 3-4 in basketball.
Okay, so I couldn't dunk on you either.
You're not dunking on anybody, Josh. Only intellectually dunking.
Oof, I don't know.
Not physically dunking.
These are tough conversations.
Yeah. Well, our listeners today have a real treat from the perspective of, for the first time in the history of the Energy and Transition podcast, the lightning round questions were put together by you.
Yes.
So if they're better, everybody should let us know so you can do them from now on. Or if they're equally as good, then what I know is we can share the responsibilities. Yes.
But we also don't read anything other than positive email anyway, so it's perfect.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Only show me the good reviews.
That's right. That's
yeah.
right.
And Todd, the rules of the lightning round are really simple. You don't get to have big, expansive answers. It's generally just yes or no, and it helps people know a little bit more about you in a very short period of time.
There you go.
Awesome.
You
All
want
right, you
to
ready?
kick it off?
Morning person or night owl?
Night owl.
Oh, man.
Coffee or tea?
Coffee.
Beach or the mountains?
Mountains.
Does the Ukraine-Russia conflict continue into 2024?
Yes.
Summer or winter?
Winter.
S&P 500 for the rest of the year from here, bullish or bearish?
From here.
And from here is about 4,100 S&P.
Bullish. Good positive.
Cash or crypto?
Cash.
Road trip or flying?
Road trip.
And let's go wine or beer?
Beer.
He hesitated.
Whiskey. I was thinking whiskey because that would be my choice.
What's that last one there? And then
Instagram or TikTok?
Okay. Yeah, that's fine.
That was good.
Instagram or TikTok?
Yeah.
Neither.
Yeah, you're a Twitter guy.
Yes.
So I took that out because I looked you up, and I figured it'd be too easy to throw you as a Twitter guy.
Not going to find me on either one.
All right, let me ask this one, and then we're going to let Dan ask Dan. Another IRA type of bill in the next 3 years?
Yes. I think there's additions that are going to be made.
Okay.
And the most important question determining your future as a potential repeat podcast guest, will the Houston Texans make the Super Bowl in the next decade?
I've been living in Houston for a while, so no.
Nice to meet you.
I know, exactly.
Wait, before we let him go, you had a great draft.
The Texans did?
Yeah, well, you. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Here's where I'm at on the Texans. Sorry, Todd.
It's nice knowing you.
I'm so far down on the Texans that I barely paid any attention to the draft because it hasn't made any difference for the last decade.
I agree with that, but they had a tremendous draft.
I know. I may go to a game this season.
Maybe skip to season 3.
Yes, there we go.
It's going to be a tough season.
Yeah.
Well, Todd,
tougher.
this is thank you for coming on. The live audience not too bad for you? This is pretty.
Yeah, this is great.
Yeah.
It's great meeting you both. I appreciate it, and thank you for the lightning round and all the questions. So
absolutely, and we'll find more about Decarbonfuse at www.decarbonfuse.com.
Perfect.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Todd Bush.
Excellent.
Great.